Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fully Charged Show podcast. Now, in this episode, I talked to someone I've been following for years on Twitter and who's read an enormous amount of articles by him. His name is Professor Mark Jacobson. He is a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Stanford University in California and director of its atmosphere and energy program. And over the last 20 years, he has developed computer models to study the effects of fossil fuel and biomass burning on air pollution, weather and climate. He is very firmly of the opinion, and this is really what we're talking about in this episode, very firmly of the opinion that it is possible for almost every country on Earth, so every country on Earth bar one or two, literally, that would be able to function on 100% renewably generated electricity for all their needs. Heating, transport, engineering, manufacturing, everything can all be powered by electricity, and it can all be powered by renewable electricity. He has written a number of fascinating books and articles, the latest being, it's a very obvious title, 100% Clean Renewable Energy and Storage for Everything. He's also involved with the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation. I don't know what Leonardo does. Apparently he's very busy here and there. But I know he runs this foundation, and I know Mark is involved in that as well. But before we start, let's just hear a word from our wonderful sponsor, who is also working towards making a 100% renewably powered world a distinct possibility. Well, that's enough of the pre-waffle. I mean, the obvious things stand still. Please do subscribe to this podcast. The numbers of subscribers are growing. The numbers of listeners are growing. We're getting great feedback. It is amazing. We've got some other fabulous guests coming in the future. But for now, please welcome to the Fully Charged Plus podcast, Professor Mark Jacobson. My Energy is putting the I back into British innovation. My Energy is putting the I back into inventing the future. My Energy is putting the I back into inspiring a nation. Recharging the world with green, smart energy. Charge your EV with your PV and more. Visit myenergy.com and help to spark the green revolution. My Energy, driving the charge to a greener future. Taking time to join us. I'm very interested because I've been following you for years on Twitter, so I kind of have a bit of background knowledge, but I've done a bit of research, which I'm really bad at doing. I'm not a scientist like you. I'm very lazy. So, I mean, one of the intriguing things is that I've seen some interviews where you mention when you were playing tennis as a young man in Los Angeles, San Diego, and you noticed how bad the air was. I want you to tell us about that, but because I first visited the United States in 1987 and landed in Los Angeles and thought I'd caught something on the plane, that there was something wrong with me because my eyes were running and the back of my throat hurts and I couldn't see properly. And my eyes were stinging, I just got off the plane. And the lovely people I was staying with who were Los Angelinos said, no, it's just normal. Don't worry.
Yeah, you get used to it, right?
Yeah, and it was really noticeable because, I mean, at the time I was living in London. London is anything but a clean city. But I guess it's the geographical layout, particularly of Los Angeles, that when it got bad there, it was catastrophically bad.
Yeah, it's a different type of air pollution than in London. It's more driven by the sunlight, combined with the emissions from 13 million cars and industry and homes and just this cooked up smog that gets produced in Los Angeles. It's whereas London, the type of smog is more based on emissions. There's less sunlight. Yeah. So it's more based on the raw emissions. Yeah. And a low-lying inversion or fog.
Yes. We do. It's better now than it was it's better than when I was a kid. I do remember it when I was a child. It was shocking then, and it isn't as bad now. But it's still there's terrible problems there. But because it sounds like you were like really good at tennis. You weren't just like somebody who just went down the park and knocked a few balls around. You were like,
I mean, there's a different lifetime, and I had my moments where I played. I played some pretty good players.
Right. Oh, good. But then you went into academia. I mean, that's when you decided to change.
Well, I mean, I knew after I played college tennis, I played some professional tennis, and I just, I knew I wasn't going to get to the top.
Yeah.
And I decided to obsolete myself sooner rather than later. And, I knew I eventually wanted to go back and study more and maybe research and become a professor. So I pretty much planned that ahead of time. And I played tennis professionally for a year and a half.
Oh, right. Oh, you actually did play. I didn't realize you played professionally. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, although halfway through that year and a half, I broke my knee, a bone in my knee. And that set me back. That pretty much ruined the rest of the period. But fortunately, I'd already applied to graduates to go to a PhD at UCLA.
Right.
And that's where I ended up doing my PhD and got into the field that I am now.
Yeah. Because that is that is the thing that fascinates me, is that you, in a sense, you came into, did you come into the topic from your experience of localized air pollution rather than, because that's certainly that was my experience. I went, this car stinks. Why am I driving this car? It really makes a horrible smell.
No, I knew it. So when I was like 13 is when I was going down to Los Angeles and San Diego to play tennis, and where I noticed the smog was bad. And, it was around that time I thought, well, why should people live like this?
Yeah.
And I thought this would be something when I grow up, I wanted to address this problem. So in the back of my mind the entire time, I directed all my studies, my undergraduate studies. I wanted to study air pollution as an undergraduate at Stanford, but there was no program at all to do that. In fact, I could only find 2 classes that were remotely related, and they were only partly related. So, but that was my goal, was to try to understand and solve these problems. And I did it at Stanford by studying groundwater pollution, because that was the closest they had to air pollution.
Wow. Wow. But then
engineering.
But then, so you became you've become very active in the sort of climate movement, which is, in this country, it's not even contentious. It's just something that some people do and other people listen to and go, oh, and get depressed about. Whereas in America, it's become a very polarized debate, which is quite hard to see, because I think in Europe in general, it's generally accepted. There's some outlying crazies that say it's a fake thing and it's all down to lasers or something. I don't know, lizards. But generally speaking, it's an accepted thing. Then the debate is all about what we do about it, and the arguments about what we do about it.
And I think in the U.S. it's because there's such a huge oil and gas industry, and there's a huge production of oil and huge production of gas and also coal, that these industries became entrenched, and then they influence policymakers. They lobby, they put false advertisements out or greenwashing advertisements. So it's really the industry that drove people's opinions over the decades. Whereas I think maybe there's less in Europe, less drilling and raw oil, gas, and coal. Yes,
there's less,
mining and stuff. So there's less of an industry push. Yeah. Although I think the diesel industry is pretty strong.
Yeah,
and
the diesel lobby has been very active here.
Reducing regulations related to diesel particle emissions.
Yeah. But then, so what I'm really interested in then is your argument. So out of that, because presumably when you were studying things like air pollution or groundwater pollution, you weren't thinking, I'm asking, where you think, we need solar panels and wind turbines, and batteries. I mean, in a sense, that technology barely existed. It was in its very early stages at that time.
Right. Well, I did actually in 1985 at Stanford. I took this one class that really shaped me quite a bit, and it was taught by a professor named Gil Masters, who's written several books on renewable energy systems. Right. And I think his first book actually was, which he co-authored, was More, Better Homes and Garbage, which was how to live a sustainable life.
Right.
And actually, but in that class, he taught about wind turbines and their efficiencies and solar panels and all. It was an engineering class. It was all numbers on solar and wind and some geothermal. But the key thing was that he'd actually done these calculations looking at the efficiency of wind turbines empirically, and that information had never been published in a book. It was just in his class notes that I'd taken this class.
Wow.
And so 15 years later, around the year 2000, when I actually did start my career after going to graduate school, I learned atmospheric modeling, how to build basically a an air pollution model that I applied to Los Angeles, and then I expanded that to make it a global climate model. So, from 1990 around till today, most of my work has been computer modeling of air pollution and climate. But around 1999 or so, that's when I started looking at solutions to the problem, because my whole goal for my career has always been to understand the problem. And then once you understand it, then you can come up with solutions that are, actually work.
Yeah.
And so when I started looking at solutions, the first thing I wanted to look at was, well, how, is it possible to actually satisfy the Kyoto Protocol, which was in 1997, where the international community had decided to see if it was possible to reduce emissions significantly. And for the United States, I looked, is it possible to actually satisfy the Kyoto Protocol by replacing coal with wind? Or I think it was 60% of coal with wind would satisfy the Kyoto Protocol at the time. And I did a calculation where I actually went back to Professor Masters' class notes from 1985 to where he had the efficiency of a wind turbine as a function of just a few parameters, and it actually was very applicable to any wind turbine. So I picked some modern wind turbines at the time and found that it was possible to replace 60% of coal with a certain number of wind turbines at a low cost. And this actually, I published a small paper in Science magazine with Professor Masters. He was a co-author. It was only 3/4 of one page. It was the shortest paper I ever wrote, but it got the most hate mail of any article I've ever written ever since or before. It was just, in fact, there was this one guy who wrote this. He wrote this long analysis and criticism, and he said he was just a concerned citizen. And it turned out like somebody did an investigation who this guy was, and it turned out to be the former senior vice president of the National Coal Association. And,
so no vested interest whatsoever. Wow.
So I started looking at wind in the late 1990s, but that eventually expanded to solar and other renewables.
Right. So that was in the late 1990s that paper was published?
Well, it was published, I think, in 2000, maybe early 2001, but we started it like 1999.
Yeah, because in that time, the expansion. If you think, in the last 10 years, the complete transition in electric vehicles has gone from, there were 2 available in the UK 10 years ago. There's now, I think we worked at about 140 different models available now today. So that's a big expansion. And in 2010. We were still around 40% of our power in the UK was from coal. Today, it's just gone under 1%.
Yeah,
over a year. Not in one particular moment when it's windy, just over the whole year. So that transition is extraordinary, isn't it? That can have happened in that time, and that technology has moved on. What I'm intrigued to know is, did the maths, the analysis of the efficiency of a wind turbine in 1985, have those figures held true for when we're now talking at like 12 megawatt? Wind turbines, single turbines.
For every single turbine every single geared turbine, I don't think the equation applies to gearless turbines, but for geared turbines, which most turbines are,
the big ones are,
it works no matter what the size, from 1 kilowatt to 10, 12 megawatts.
Yeah. Wow.
So it's an amazing equation. It's just, it's empirical, and it just works for everything. But you can get same information by doing more detailed analysis, but if you want to do back of the envelope, it's an amazing equation.
Right.
It still works.
And that was from 85. That is amazing, because I'm just trying to think what a wind turbine would have looked like in 1985. Not that there weren't any 12 megawatt ones.
No, they're mostly less than 1 megawatt. But we've been testing that equation against new turbines as well, and it works.
But then your hypothesis now is that most countries in the world, I don't know, because you had a list of countries, but most countries in the world could be 100% renewably powered now. We don't need to burn fossils at all. Is that right?
Right. Well, we can use existing technologies to repower all countries for all purposes. Well, we looked at 143, but they represent 99.7% of all the emissions. Right. And we think the other countries would also work as well.
Yeah.
But we can use wind, solar, some geothermal in some locations, existing hydroelectric, storage through not only electric storage, but heat storage, cold storage, hydrogen storage. In the electric storage, there's not only batteries, but there's, hydroelectric dams are basically big batteries, pumped hydroelectric storage, concentrated solar power with storage. There's gravitational mass where when you have extra energy, you like push a concrete block upward, or you lift a concrete block upward. And when you need the energy, you let it fall downward. The same, you can push a train up a hill with extra energy, let it go down a hill when you need the energy. Yeah. And then there's also compressed air storage. And flywheels. There's all sorts of electricity storage options. And then there's also, people are concerned about keeping the grid stable. There's also what's called demand response, where utilities give people incentives to not use electricity at certain times of the day. That can go a long way towards keeping the grid stable. So, it turns out there are 11 countries in the world that are at 100% renewable electricity. Yeah. But there are none that are at 100% renewable all energy, which is our goal.
Yes, because I suppose that's always the thing, isn't it? Because I just read very recently, because I'd been there in the last couple of years, Tasmania is now 100% renewably powered for electricity. So it's not a whole country, but it's a state. And it's, when you're there, you think, Tasmania, that's only that little bit at the bottom of Australia. When you're on Tasmania, it's quite big. Yeah. It's a big place. There's a lot, but that's wind and hydro, I think, in particular there.
Well, and they're also they're taking their excess. I think they're higher than 100%. They're exporting their excess electricity to other parts of Australia.
Yeah. But that is because that is often the argument that I'll hear. Interestingly, not from engineers who run the national grid in the UK, for example. They don't think it's impossible to have 100% renewables, but there's so many people that just go, your renewables are great. We love them, but you can't be 100%. We need a nuclear base load. That's a very popular argument here at the moment, because we're building a massive nuclear power station only 50 miles from where I live. And it's...
So that is... part of the problem is these investments in nuclear. I mean, they're the Hinkley Point
C. It's just so expensive.
Well, it's not only so expensive, it's literally it won't be ready till like 2026, 27. And that's when they say it'll be ready. It'll be years later. But that's been going on, it's from the start to the finish, when they started planning it to when it's actually working. It's probably going to be on the order of 17, 18, 19 years.
Wow, yeah.
And you can't solve a large-scale climate problem with some technology that takes more than just a few years to get up, let alone 19 years. And that's not the only nuclear plant that's like that. There's one in Finland that's taking on the order of 19, 20, 21 years. Yeah. There's Flamanville, France.
Which still hasn't opened, still isn't operating. I don't think it is. Last time I checked.
Yeah, even in the United States, there's only one location where a nuclear plant is being built, and that's in Georgia, the Vogtle plant. And that is on the order of 16 years between planning and operation. Wow. Yeah. So and the costs are like 5 times that for new wind or solar for the same electricity. But for the wind or solar, some solar is going up. If it's rooftop solar, it's going up in a few months. Yeah. If it's utility solar, it's going up within 1 year at the most. Yeah. It could be 1.5 years. And, wind is similar, between 1 and 2 years for most wind farms. So it's like much cheaper to go to renewables now, and it takes much less time to actually plan and operate. And then combined with storage, where the storage is now dropping in price as well, it just makes more sense economically and practically just to go entirely renewables. And just, a lot of people are stuck on this thing called all of the above. Let's just try everything and hope something works. Yeah. But when you have a climate problem that you need 80% of it solved by 2030 and 100% as soon as possible after that, and you have, on top of that, you have worldwide 7 million people who die from air pollution every year. Yeah. This is avoidable air pollution from fossil fuels and biofuels, the combustion of these fuels. We really need to aggressively pursue technologies that we can implement quickly and at low cost. And nuclear is not one of these solutions. people also talk about, well, let's do carbon capture.
I was going to ask you about carbon capture.
I mean, carbon capture is a scam. It is a total and utter scam. There's no other way to put it. First of all, it doesn't even pretend to reduce air pollution. It increases air pollution because all it does is it's a technology that either you use to, in a power plant, to try to extract the CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide emissions directly from the power plant. And there's also a similar technology where you try to extract it just from the air, from the ambient air, try to take CO2 out of the air. Well, neither one of these reduces air pollution at all. All it does is try to take CO2, and CO2 is not a classic air pollutant that affects your health directly.
No.
Now, it does affect health indirectly by raising temperatures, and then temperatures feed back to air pollution. But there's no direct health impact of CO2.
Yeah. It's if as a human being you breathe in a bit of CO2, it's not damaging you.
Right. You need like 16,000 parts per million to cause problems, and the background is around 415 right now.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it not only doesn't reduce air pollution, it actually increases air pollution because you need a huge amount of energy to run carbon capture equipment. And where do you get that energy? Well, there was one carbon capture plant in the United States, in Texas, and it was actually shut down last year because it was so inefficient. But so they added carbon capture to a coal plant to try to take the CO2 out of the coal plant emissions. But what did they use to run the carbon capture equipment? They actually built a natural gas electricity generating plant to run the carbon capture equipment for the coal plant. How mindless is that? Because then they have to mine for the natural gas. So there's more mining of gas and leaked methane and other pollutants due to the mining process. Then they burn the natural gas. None of that CO2 from the burning of the natural gas is captured. And they produce the electricity. So they have more air pollution from that. And then they use the electricity to run the carbon capture equipment. It turned out the carbon capture equipment was only over 20 years, it would only reduce about 10% of the CO2 from the coal plant. So it was completely inefficient.
Yeah.
And then what did they do with the CO2 that was captured? Well, they piped it to a nearby oil field, and they then mixed the CO2 with the oil to make it less dense, to let it rise to the surface faster so they can capture more oil. So they have for that process, half the CO2 is now in the oil and gets burned when you burn the oil.
Yeah.
So that just goes back to the air. And then they have more oil that gets burned, and that results in more pollution, more carbon dioxide. The whole thing was a scam. It's just like, and it cost $1 billion for the capture equipment in the gas plant.
Yeah.
So it's just basically a tax to the public for no benefit whatsoever.
Right. So that was a publicly funded project?
Well, it was privately funded, but what happens is the consumers who buy the electricity from the coal plants,
they're paying
a higher rate.
Yeah, wow.
And so they basically get taxed for the stupidity.
I mean, it is such a scam, that stuff. There's a few people in this country. I sat on a panel with one of them, which was quite challenging, who, argue that middle class, comfortably off greenies like me, is what he was pointing at me, are forcing poor people in fuel poverty into even worse poverty by suggesting we can use renewables that are this is not 10 years ago. This is in the last 4 years, much more expensive, and coal is the only answer. I mean, the side thing, I should point out, this man does own a coal mine.
Yeah, of course. These are usually the people.
He sits in the House of Lords. He's a very, very accomplished scientist in biology, but just extraordinary. The nerve of it was just extraordinary, because you go, that's just, I'm not an energy specialist, but I've talked to enough people to go, oh no, renewables are cheaper. They're cheaper to install, cheaper to run than a coal plant. Already in this country, much cheaper, so that's why coal's gone out of fashion here, because of money, not because of being green, effectively. We're importing the coal. It's expensive.
Yeah, new coal plants are actually much more expensive than wind or solar. Well, wind and solar are the cheapest forms of new electricity by far. Like in the U.S., it's half the cost of new natural gas for new onshore wind and utility solar photovoltaics.
Yeah.
So in fact, I think it was this last month that 100% of all new electricity in the U.S. was wind and solar.
Yes, I did hear that. Yeah, all the new installation was renewables.
Yeah, in the last month.
Which is extraordinary. Now, what about so I'm glad you explained carbon capture and storage, because I just don't ever say anything. I'm now going to repeat what you said next time that comes up in a conversation, because I hear it a lot here. Well, it's very simple. We just use CCS to get rid of the problem.
I mean, it's assumed. It's just assumed that it works, and it's assumed it doesn't take any energy.
Yeah.
And it's assumed it's only a net benefit. But if you actually look at the numbers, you need energy. You always either increase air pollution or keep it the same. Well, you can only keep it the same if you use renewable energy to power the capture equipment. But if you use the renewable energy to power the capture equipment, that renewable energy is not being used to replace the coal or gas.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's also increasing air pollution, because if you use the renewable electricity to replace coal or gas, you decrease air pollution and you decrease mining as well as decrease CO2. Yeah. If you use the renewable electricity just to power carbon capture, you don't decrease air pollution, you don't decrease mining from fossil fuels, and you only reduce CO2 a little bit. And then what do you do with the CO2? Well, the CO2 is usually used either for enhancing oil recovery or sometimes synthetic fuels, but these synthetic carbonaceous fuels also get burned and produce air pollution. We don't want to use them for transportation. We want to go to electric cars, some hydrogen fuel cell.
Yeah. Because do you have an opinion on a hydrogen fuel cell technology? I mean, it's becoming a bone of contention, which is I've always found annoying, because I think of myself as a cyclist in a city. I'm cycling along and there's a diesel bus. It's horrible behind that. There's a diesel taxi. It's horrible. There's an electric one. It's fine. There's a hydrogen one. It's fine. I don't care. There's a bit of water coming out of the hydrogen one. That's as bad. So from that point of view, but I can certainly see the arguments about, particularly in this country, again, the fossil fuel lobby, hugely, determinedly, with a lot of money behind them, pushing hydrogen. Hydrogen is the future. Hydrogen fuel cell cars.
Well, so hydrogen is good for certain applications, and if it's produced with clean renewable electricity only. So the fossil fuel industry is pushing it because they want to produce hydrogen with methane, natural gas, the main component of natural gas, which we don't want to do. We want to produce, if we're going to produce hydrogen, we want to produce it from electricity. It's called electrolysis, where you split water to produce hydrogen. And that is the cleanest way to do it. Now, then what do you want to use the hydrogen for? It would only be for long distance heavy transport, and some applications like steel. Some steel factories can run on hydrogen instead of fossil fuels. And there are certain electricity applications like microgrids, like remote grids, remote communities, like in the Arctic, for example, where you have a very unreliable source of electricity, let's say wind. But there is a lot of wind, but it's just not necessarily when you need it. And then you can use that to produce hydrogen that can be stored and then used for both electricity and heat production. Now, you don't want to use hydrogen for short distance transport and passenger vehicles. I mean, it can be used, it's clean, but it just is very inefficient compared with battery electric vehicles for short distance or even medium distance passenger vehicles or light trucks, or even some heavy trucks up to 1,000 kilometers. But where hydrogen actually takes over in efficiency compared to batteries is for long distance heavy transport, such as long distance aircraft, long distance ships, let's say trains that aren't electrified, long distance trains, and then even trucks that have to go more than, let's say, 1,500 kilometers. Those would be best to be hydrogen, but not the short distance, and not normal electricity generation, because normal like electricity generation in a community, let's say a city, it takes energy. Well, it takes energy to produce the hydrogen by electrolysis. Then you compress it, and then you use it in a fuel cell, and there are losses all along the way. So you might as well just take the original electricity to produce hydrogen and just put it in a battery and then run it for electricity generation. So that's more efficient. There's much less loss the overall equipment for both, you have to compare, but batteries will win out in the end for most normal electricity generation.
Yeah.
For storage, for electricity generation.
But now I would love to talk a bit about climate, because it's it's an area that I generally don't refer to in the show, simply because I can't be bothered with the argument. I can't be bothered with the sort of negative arguments. And also I always feel I don't know. I don't have enough information to argue the point. Someone that comes to me and goes, diesel's cleaner than electricity, I've got a lot of arguments. I kind of know where I stand on that one. But with climate, I'm not sure. The one thing I know is when I was born, 1956, the carbon particles per million was 334. Okay. And it's now 400 415. So it went over 400 a couple of years ago, didn't it? Which for the first time. And I kind of understand the basics, but when you say you're modeling that, so I've certainly heard, I've met and talked to scientists in the UK that are doing that sort of thing. And you're still running those models. Is I suppose the basic question is there any hope for any of us?
Yeah.
How bad is it?
If we transition the world to entirely clean renewable energy with about 80% of the transition by 2030 and 100%, ideally 2035, but
right.
If it's 2040, we probably get away with it. We can reverse this problem. In fact, I'll just mention that today there's a group of us called the 100% Renewable Energy Strategy Group that just released a declaration. They're signed by 47 scientists,
right.
Sorry, 46 scientists. And it really called for countries and the international community to transition as fast as possible to renewable energy, and that this can avoid climate catastrophe by such a transition. Now, there are political and social barriers to overcome, but technically and economically it's possible. And if everybody's on the same page, then those political barriers disappear. So it's really getting information out to people who are interested to know, don't have a vested interest in the current fossil fuel industry.
Yeah.
That we can transition. This is, the world, it is feasible, not in every country. We looked at 143 countries in our own work, but other groups have looked at many countries as well. So I'm optimistic that we can transition.
Right. I'm a little bit more optimistic now. And I think, and it's to do with the technology and the general public opinion I'm aware of in the British Isles has swung so amazingly to that. So there's a newspaper in the British Isles called the Daily Express, which would be on the just close to extreme right. It's hyper conservative. They were doing climate changes due to the sun's activities 5 years ago. It's not real. And all the news is fake and all that stuff. They've pivoted 100%. They're now Britain's leading green newspaper. They're still very conservative, anti-immigration, pro-Brexit, anti-this, anti-that, hate this, can't stand foreigners, all the normal sort of stuff. But they've gone 100%. And there's a man that we've worked with for many years who runs our kind of the biggest renewable energy supply company. So you buy your electricity from them, a company called Ecotricity, who have wind turbines and solar farms, and they're developing all kinds of technologies. And he's written a big article in there, and it's been a huge hit. It's been really interesting to see. So that, mindset is changing, which even because our current administration is very conservative, but they're very pro renewables, offshore wind, electric vehicles, and they're putting their money where their mouth is. It is interesting to see that happen. And I think that is happening around the world. It stopped happening in America for 4 years without question.
Well, actually, it
didn't, did it? Yeah.
It stopped happening at the federal level in America. But it turns out that at the state level, there's a big push, even in Republican states, for renewable energy. Well, when I said not a policy push, but because it's so cheap, because wind and solar have become so cheap, it's been going up everywhere. So, for example, just a few days ago, it was announced that the Southern Power Pool, which is a group of around 6 or 7 states that were all like from North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, northern Texas, and areas around there, which are all won by Trump in the election. They announced that for the first time ever, wind is now the largest source of electric power in that whole group of states.
Because you do not think, as an outsider, you don't think that. You just think that's all coal. That's coal country.
Yeah, it took over from coal as the largest source of electricity.
Wow.
But that's because it's so cheap. Wind is cheap there, and it doesn't matter if you're Republican, Democrat, Independent. If you want it, you're going to benefit from the low cost of clean renewable energy. Yeah. And this was going on under Trump. He didn't know about it or support it. He doesn't like wind because he lost that lawsuit in Ireland.
Oh, no, in Scotland, off his golf course.
Scotland, yeah. Yes. That's the golf course.
Yeah.
So he's always hated wind, especially offshore wind, claiming it causes all sorts of problems.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. Yeah. No, that was so funny. And oh, dear. There are some really, I'm not going to repeat any of the things, but just some very Scottish signs that were big. There's photographs of smiling police officers at demonstrators when Trump was at his golf course in Scotland, and the things on their placards, you don't even see on the most raucous of American demonstrations. That was really offensive language. I'm not going to lie. The Scottish don't pull their punches. So he wasn't terribly popular there. That's true. But I think that's a critically important aspect, and I'm sure you're extremely aware of that how it's such a difficult thing not to be politicized. But I've had a criticism today from clearly someone who is a Trump supporter who can't watch my show anymore because I've got political. And I think that means that I've been mildly, and I've never, I really hold it back, but I've been mildly critical of the Trump administration's only in regards to their policy to renewables and electric vehicles and offshore wind and all those things, not in any other aspect. But that is seen as being political. And you just go, that stuff shouldn't be political, as we're experiencing, as you're seeing there. And we're seeing here, it's very important for it not to, climate change should not be political. It's science. In a way, isn't it?
Well, the thing is, though, and there have been public opinions polls about this, where I remember one poll, they asked how many people believe that climate change is an important problem. And it turned out like only about 66% of the people in the poll said climate change was an important problem. But the same poll, they asked how many people want to transition the world to 100% renewables, and it was 82%.
Wow, that's interesting. So wow.
The thing is, you can be in favor of the solution to the problem, in this case, transitioning to renewables, without believing in the problem.
Yeah.
And actually, I don't care if people don't believe in the problem.
No, it doesn't matter then, does it?
If you believe in the solution, then that's what's important. And that's what we're seeing here. People like renewable energy for a lot of other reasons, aside from it solves the climate problem.
Yeah.
It's cheaper, creates jobs, reduces international transfers of energy, and creates energy independence. It reduces air pollution. A lot of people care about air pollution, but don't care about climate.
Yeah.
Because they know somebody who's suffering from asthma or they've suffered themselves. So people resonate a lot with renewable energy, regardless of your political affiliation.
Yeah.
I mean, there are people there is a party line about fossil fuels because the fossil fuel industry has just put so much money into certain parties.
Yeah.
But, most people, though, are more practical. And, as long as you don't talk about climate, for example, with regard to renewable energy solutions, most people are in favor of it, as you see in the UK.
Yes, no, that's very true. Because that's exactly the reason I guess I don't mention it. I must have been, it wasn't a conscious decision. I just realized after about 5 years of doing this show, I never mentioned climate. I'm always talking about local area air pollution, very much so. And that's universally understood and accepted that that's a problem. That isn't, people don't deny that. But I mean, so I wonder what your attitude is, because there's the other interesting thing I think is which is in a sense part of a wider debate about governments and corporations, and that's currently raging with things like Facebook and Google and Apple and their incredible power, if you like. I mean, they've become sort of almost separate countries, and they can make decisions and do things, and you go, oh, we can't really stop them. There's no government can stop them. But I mean, do you think, do you have a preference to whether a government says we've got to go 100% renewable, or a private corporation, or I mean, which one? Because it's a kind of confusing as a European, the American attitude to government. I'm slightly confused about, and always have been.
Well, I think in terms of solving the problem, it really has to be done at multiple levels. So there is certainly the federal government or national governments, state governments, local governments, but also individual cities. There are actually, in the US, there are 180 cities that have passed laws to go to 100% renewables.
Wow.
Worldwide, there are over 300.
Yeah. I didn't realize 180 in the United States. That's amazing. Wow.
Yeah, including all the big cities. They've passed laws to go to 100% renewable. There are also actually 14 states and territories in the U.S. that have passed laws as well, including California, New York, and Washington, D.C., Rhode Island, and several others. But companies, too. There are 280 international businesses, including 8 of the 10 biggest businesses in the world, and that have passed resolutions on their own to go to 100% renewables. And Apple and Google, 2 of the biggest ones in the world, have actually met that goal, according to what they've said.
Yeah.
But the fact that actually these companies are really pushing investment. So they're really important for the solution. I mean, for example, in the Netherlands, there's a new offshore wind farm being built. I think it was like 760 megawatts or something like that. But Amazon is just bought half the output from that new wind farm. So they're basically going to take half the output to run all their European operations.
Yeah.
So you need that kind of investment to put up these wind farms. Otherwise, these companies would be using fossil fuels, just grid electricity. So it's really, I think they've been actually driving these large numbers of that we see in the big growth of renewables in the last year or two, these company investments, because they all want to, go renewable. And one way is to either invest in a new wind farm or solar farm, or the other is to try to buy energy from an existing one. And so the new ones, though, there are a lot of new ones going up because of these investments by companies.
Right. Now, there's a topic that I'm very interested in at the moment. I just recently attended and it's so extraordinary that you can do that so easily. I was sitting right where I am now, but I attended a conference from Africa about minerals and minerals extraction and mining and Africa's role in the energy transition. And there were 2 Africans taking part who were involved in, instigating fair mining practices within and safe mining, and and not allowing the same pattern that happened with the oil industry. Which, I mean, the Niger Delta is an extremely good example of how not to allow a corporation to run roughshod over human beings. But I mean, in the group of scientists that you've recently come up with this new accord, was that discussed where the materials come from? Because I mean, it's another one of those perfectly legitimate reservations that people might have. They go, well, yeah, I know oil's bad, but look, there's children being forced to mine cobalt, with zero understanding that cobalt is used in oil refining it's almost as much as it is in batteries. We live in a really complicated world, and it's I mean, was that part of the discussion as to presume we're going to need vast amounts of materials that we maybe haven't been using that much of in the past to produce the stuff we need?
Well, there are materials, but it's much less mining than under the current system. Yeah. Keep in mind that right now with fossil fuels, there's not only mining for the equipment, but there's continuous, which is, let's say, one-time equipment mining for building a fossil fuel plant. But there's also continuous mining every day for the fuels themselves. So, for example, in the United States, every year there are 50,000 new oil and gas wells drilled. They pockmark the U.S. There are now over 2.3 million active wells and another 2 million inactive wells. I mean, they just destroy the landscape of the U.S. I think 1.3% of all the U.S. land area is covered with the fossil fuel industry.
Wow.
Now we eliminate all that mining,
for all that stuff. Yeah.
Fuel mining. All we have is the equipment mining. So, but that's like one-time mining. Let's say for batteries for a battery electric car, or for stationary storage, or mining for a wind turbine. The wind turbine lasts 30 years and then it can be recycled. A lot of materials can be recycled. So it's like one-time mining every 30 years versus the one-time mining for the fossil fuels plus the continuous everyday mining. So it's orders of magnitude less mining,
right?
No matter how you look at it, for going to clean renewable energy.
Yeah. Well, there's also that thing.
Get rid of all the mining, but it eliminates 95% or more.
I mean, there was a mining engineer I spoke to on here last year who's Australian, and he said by 2050 we've got to stop digging up. That was his analysis of the mining industry in the next 50 years, or the next 30 years. That the notion of a circular economy, that you do recycle. Because we went to visit a battery recycling plant in Germany last year, and they're doing 94% of the materials in a battery they can reuse to make other batteries, which is, that's my argument. You show me 1 litre of diesel that's been recycled after use. It just doesn't happen.
Well, they're trying to recycle by carbon capture equipment.
Oh, yes, sorry. I forgot carbon capture. Damn, my argument's completely unwound. But that, I think certainly that is in a sense, the ethics of mining, I think, are very important. That there are artisanal mines in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and there have been reports of children working down mines, and it's just, doesn't matter what your politics are or your attitudes to anything, that's just wrong. And that has to be dealt with. And I mean, it is that was what was encouraging about that conference. They are dealing with it. If for no other reason that if you're Glencore, and one of the biggest companies on earth, and everyone thinks that you're employing children, which they never have, and it's illegal, the mining, they've got massive diggers that do mining. They don't have kids digging stuff up, but it reflects badly on them. And so they're really making positive efforts to change that, to fund local schools, to encourage people to, work within the legitimate industry, which is intriguing and hopeful. But it's hard not to be a bit cynical about multi-billion-pound corporations occasionally.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, mining people bring it up a lot, but most people are just not aware that it's you're reducing mining significantly with this transition. Well,
and also, what we're talking on now, there's cobalt in the machine I'm talking on, there's cobalt in the machine you're talking on, and it's going through a series of servers, all of which have cobalt in them. Right. We're very, very, it doesn't matter whether you're driving an electric car or not, you're involved in that, whatever.
Right.
But we'll definitely wind up now, because it's been amazing to talk to you. But I just tell me about. So, have you got a book coming out soon? Because that's the one bit I might not know about.
Yeah, actually, it was published recently. It's a book called 100% Clean Renewable Energy and Storage for Everything.
Sorry, I did know. But that's brilliant. That's my brain not working. And that's just come out in the United States, has it?
It's worldwide.
Right. Oh, great.
It's available worldwide, and I'm using it mostly. Well, I'm using it as a textbook as well, but it's pretty. It really describes what we need to do to transition to 100% renewable energy worldwide. It describes wind energy and solar energy in detail, and batteries and other types of storage technologies. Looks at things that we don't need for a transition or won't be useful for a transition, including carbon capture, biofuels, bioenergy, and nuclear power, and why we need to focus on clean renewable sources. And so it really tries to go into detail about the technologies available and needed, and keeping the grid stable, and other aspects of transitioning to 100% renewables.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I will definitely put a link to that in the show notes, because that sounds, I'm sure a lot of our listeners are going to be very interested in that. And then what projects have you got at the moment? Because I just want to know a bit more about how you run a climate model, because I've seen a documentary where people were looking at just hundreds of of animated tables on a huge screen of, bar graphs and pie charts and things like that. I mean, is that what you see when you're studying that? I can't quite picture it in my head what it is you're doing.
Well, actually, the model itself will produce numbers, and then the graphing is a separate
Right.
task. So I'm not very good at graphs, but I do mostly working on generating the numbers.
Right.
And then the problem is you have too many numbers and you don't know what to do with them. But so my first part of my career, I'm looking at like the effects of looking at the atmospheric chemistry and atmospheric physics and radiation transfer a lot. Looking at, for example, what's the impact of black carbon, the main component of diesel exhaust, for example,
right.
What's the effect of that on climate? And it turned out that black carbon, based on computer calculations that were backed up by other people running simulations as well, and is the second leading cause of global warming after carbon dioxide.
Right. And so it is different. I just wanted to make sure that black carbon is a different chemical compound than carbon dioxide.
Yeah. So black carbon, carbon dioxide is a gas.
Yeah.
You can't see it. Black carbon is a particle, and a particle is really the combination of lots of gases that have changed state to a liquid or a solid.
Right.
In this case, a solid. And when you see a diesel bus go by and you see black smoke, that's black
right.
carbon.
And that doesn't, because you always see that sort of disappear after a while, but I'm now guessing it doesn't disappear.
It dilutes. It's still there. It just dilutes. Right. It does come out of the atmosphere fairly quickly, but it's always being emitted. And every gram of black carbon is about 1 million times more powerful than the same gram of CO2 at causing warming.
Right.
And the reason is because black carbon absorbs sunlight directly and then heats up and then radiates the heat to the air around it. Whereas carbon dioxide is invisible to sunlight. It only absorbs infrared radiation, which is weaker. And so you need a lot more CO2 to cause a similar greater climate effect. But the difference is that CO2 lasts in the air much longer than black carbon. So even though black carbon is 1 million times more powerful per unit mass, there's orders of magnitude less black carbon in the air at a given time. But nevertheless, when you add everything up, black carbon causes about half the warming, well, a little less than half the warming of CO2 in the atmosphere. But the nice thing is, if you stop its emissions, you can eliminate most of that warming pretty quickly.
Right. Yeah, that is interesting. So actually, because I've raved and ranted about diesel cars, diesel trucks for years. That's an extra. And they are diminishing, and the sales have stopped. Basically, no one's buying the damn things anymore, which is a great relief. But that would be quite a quick change if we could say get rid of all diesel engines in the next 10 years. We would see quite a dramatic drop in black carbon then, presumably.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And that would have a quick benefit for climate. Now, I should point out that you do see a lot of pollution, particles. Almost all of the pollution you see in the air is due to particles. But there are a lot of particles that are reflective and they're light colored. So if you see black smoke, that's black carbon. If you see brown smoke, that's called brown carbon.
Right.
And those are both cause warming. But if you see white smoke or gray, that's usually causing cooling.
Right.
And so there's actually more cooling particles than warming particles in the atmosphere. But if you can selectively reduce the warming particles first, you not only reduce health problems, because all particles cause health problems, but you eliminate more warming very quickly. So you can slow down the rise of temperature by eliminating black carbon quickly. But, the thing is, we need to eliminate all emissions as fast as possible to solve the climate and the health problem simultaneously. And to do this, we're really just going to have to transfer to clean renewable energy. That will solve all these problems. In the interim, there'll be some switches of some temperatures might go up for a little bit, some might go down. But if we actually do this transition, we eliminate the particles that cause health problems as well as the particles that cause either cooling or warming. Yeah. And we eliminate the greenhouse gases that cause warming of the climate. So we can solve in the long term the climate problem, eliminate 7 million air pollution deaths per year. And because it'll it'll create jobs. Doing this transition, we create worldwide about 28 million more jobs than lost.
Wow.
We save huge amounts of money in terms of health and climate. We create energy stability, energy security, and sustainable energy for the future. So there's very little downside to such a transition.
Yeah. That is a brilliant note to end on. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Well, there we go. I really hope you enjoyed listening to that. It was an amazing conversation to have with him. He is a clearly incredibly well-researched, well-informed man, making very, very plausible arguments as to the way the human race should aim its abilities, its considerable abilities, as opposed to drilling and extracting fossil fuels. Excuse me. Anyway, that's enough. Please, as I said at the beginning, but I will remind you, if you have any options to subscribe to this podcast on your podcast downloading applications, we would love you even more than we do now, which is a lot of love. And that's all. As always, if you have been, thank you for listening.